So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you very much for joining, and welcome to this, which is the next in the series of scheduled webinars on Fusion Metadata Registry. For those who may not be totally familiar with what the tool is, FMR, as it's called, is the free-to-use structural metadata registry, STMX, metadata registry from the BIS, providing a centralized and controlled repository for structural metadata for the entire statistics lifecycle, including data collection, data production, and data dissemination. So in addition to its core role as a structural metadata store, FMR provides a number of other really useful functions. And one of those, and the subject of today's webinar, is Excel reporting templates. So Excel reporting templates aim to make collection of data using Excel simpler, more efficient, and better controlled. So the speaker today is Matt Nelson. Matt is the architect of Fusion Metadata Registry, so has a extreme depth of knowledge in this and the subject of Excel reporting templates. My name is Glenn Tice. Thank you for listening, and I'm going to hand over to Matt now to proceed with the presentation. Thank you, Matt. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Glenn. And welcome everybody. So as Glenn said, this presentation is on data collection using we call Excel reporting templates. In my opinion, this is a really great feature of Fusion Metadata Registry. It's extremely feature rich. So there's a lot of information to cover in this presentation. So I'm just going to crack on to the first slide, which is really just an overview of the topics that will be covered. I'm not going to go through these topics in order, but the information that's going to be presented over the course of this presentation is going to touch upon each of these topics. This session is going to be a mixture of PowerPoint and demo via the user interface of FMR. So on that note, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out of the PowerPoint and we'll just quickly take a quick look at the FMR so we can get an idea of the tool that we're going to be working with and using to demonstrate reporting templates. So what FMR is, most of you, or a number of you I'm sure already know what FMR is and what it does. I'm just going to show you some of the core content that FMR stores, which I'm sure most of you are already familiar with, but for those of you that aren't, FMR in this context, data collection, is going to be storing metadata that describes a data set. And that metadata is going to be things to describe the dimensions of our data set that we're going to be collecting data against. And then it stores the metadata which describes the template, which will be generated to allow the data to report, to allow the user to report data. So when we look at the metadata page here, we're looking at code lists. So these are useful lists of codes related to particular topics. For example, sex will have male, female, other, not applicable, and things like this. Reference area code lists, so this is various countries. We take these code lists, we take some other metadata like the concept schemes, and then we use that to build data structures. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with these types of concepts, but for those that aren't, we view a data structure in terms of dimensionality. So when we are collecting data or disseminating data, it's always corresponding to a data structure definition, and that tells us the breakdown of our data across the dimensions. So here's an example data structure for education, and there's a dimension called geographic area, and here's the various values that dimension can take. So these are our core structures that we're going to be looking at in order to construct a reporting template. In this presentation, what I did is I selected one data structure definition, which I was going to use as the data structure which all the reporting template examples are built against. And I selected this structure from UNICEF, and it's to do with immunization. And I selected it because there's only a few dimensions. You can see there's what's called reference area, which is essentially the country dimension, an indicator dimension with quite a large number of indicators. And as I'm sure most of you will probably know, but it's important to state, behind these labels are the identifiers. So where a user probably is more familiar with reading labels to understand what it is they're reporting, machines like to work with identifiers. There's good reasons for that. For example, labels could change frequently. They may be multilingual labels, so you might be describing indicators in various languages. So the IDs are basically fixed. So when we report data, we report them against IDs. Now, here's something which probably looks familiar for a data reporting form. This is not a reporting template. I'm showing the report in a completely different way. And the idea here is if we know what our data structure is, we know the dimensions of our data structure, we can quite easily build headers in a CSV or an Excel workbook, and then we can get the user to fill in the form. In fact, I can do this right now. Here's the immunization data structure definition that we were talking about with indicator, vaccine, and age. And for immunization, and I can put a start date and an end date in. I can create a template which exports a very, very basic layout of something a user could fill in for data. So here they would fill in something like CAN for Canada, some kind of indicator, identifier, an identifier for the vaccine. So maybe it's HEP, an age, and then the numbers, the reported observations for the years across the top. And that's a perfectly valid way of collecting data. But that's not a reporting template. So this is what we did. And the user basically builds up the Excel worksheet with the values that they're reporting. When they submit this to the system, it would have to validate they've entered the values correctly, the fact that CAN is indeed a country in the country code list, and the indicators are correct and the vaccines are correct. So there's a lot of server-side validation to check that what's being reported is expected for that data structure definition. We have a plugin called Fusion Excel, which can help generate these types of forms and fill them in because they do have their place in data collection. But this is a difference with a reporting template. A reporting template is more of a cross-tabulation of information. So rather than just headings across the top and the user filling in the values, in a reporting template, the data collector essentially defines the layout of the form. So they'll define that the header contains the dimension vaccine, and that the rows are going to be broken down by geographic area and age. And then the reporting template can be generated based on that information. And then the user simply fills in the white cells, the observation cells. So you can start to see that the user has less chance of making errors because they're not picking the codes. The headings are already generated for them. So they simply fill in the observation values. It's important to note that reporting templates were built such that no VBA was required. This solution is pure Excel. So what's generated by the FMR is just an Excel workbook that the user can open and fill in. They don't need any special plugins. all the information required to read the workbook back into the FMR to convert it, to validate it, and to export SQMX datasets is embedded within the workbook. And the workbook is, the worksheets within the workbook are all protected, they're password protected. You can actually define what the passwords are in that protection. So the user can only edit the white cells, because we don't want the user just randomly deleting rows and columns. So everything is protected to stop them from corrupting the worksheet. You can see labels are generated here. So actually in multilingual, if you have multilingual metadata, then you can generate the worksheet for a particular locale, and the information will come out in that locale. But underneath this are the IDs. That's what the system works on. Okay, the reporting template, it's completely metadata-driven solution, and it makes use of all the SQMX metadata that we know and love, which are things like I showed earlier with the data structure, the data flows, the code lists. We'll look at how these other types of metadata are used throughout this presentation: constraints and hierarchies and validation rules. Now, the benefit of being metadata driven is any changes to the SQMX metadata. So let's say you add a new code to a code list, or you you change the data structure, or you change the labels, or you add a multilingual label. That's automatically reflected in the reporting template, so the Excel workbook that you generate. Those metadata changes are reflected automatically. And also the same rules that the FMR would use to validate the data set, the same metadata used to validate the data set is used to generate the template. So if you have constraints, and for those of you that don't know what constraints are, we talk about this a bit later. If you have constraints that restrict what a user can report, that will be reflected in the generated template. And then when the template is submitted back to the system, it will use the same rules to verify the content is correct. So actually it really reduces the room for user error in reporting data. And of course, the reporting template is of course not the end point. It can then be converted into an SQMX dataset for processing downstream. So if we look at a very simple workflow of creating a reporting template, what we do in this first circle here is we define the domain, the collection. So we create our code list, our concepts, our data structure definition, our data flow. So at this point, we have basically something a bit like the UNICEF immunization data flow defined. That's all defined. That's our domain. We then, in the FMR, create data providers. So we say, okay, we've got a provider for this country, a provider for this country, a provider for this country. And then on top of that, we just design the reporting template. And the reporting template is simply a definition of which dimensions are used in the header and the rows. There's a lot more to it than that, which I'll show you, but in its most simple form, it's how you want to lay out the dimensions in the headers and the rows. Okay. And for those of you that like looking at kind of models rather than workflows, it looks a little bit like this. So we have we have everything from the data flow down is what I showed earlier with the UNICEF immunization data flow. We then create a data provider, or more, or many data providers. And then we link the data providers to our data flow, because we have to say which data providers can report for which data flow. We use this construct called the provision agreement. And then we design the report template. So I'm going to show now a very simple report template being created using these pieces of metadata. What you should see is the data flow. Here, education, immunization, we're going to be looking at immunization. I can create data providers here. So I've actually created a few: Brazil, Canada, Sweden. I mean, I could create maybe like UK, for example. It's very straightforward to create a data provider. And then we link the data provider to the data flow. And actually, there's quite a nice way of doing this in the data flow. You can, on the third step, you just add a data provider. That's it. So that's that done effectively. And then we click finish, and then there's a new data provider for that flow. Reporting template. That's the next thing. Now I've created a few here. We'll look at some of these later. What I'm going to do is just create a new one called demo. So I did that quite quickly. I'm logged in. Top left, there's this kind of cogs icon. I click here and I say create new reporting template. I'm going to give it the ID of demo with the name of demo, and it's going to be maintained by the UNICEF agency because I'm going to be looking at their immunization data set. Now you'll notice we have this worksheet page. There's one worksheet per data flow. A report template can collect data for multiple data flows in one go. But as part of this demo, I'm just going to add one data flow, which is our immunization one. The worksheet, it's asked me what I want the worksheet to be called when it generates the Excel workbook. I'll just call it immunization. We have things here, which I will talk about later. And then this is kind of the builder, if you like. This is the table builder. So what I'm going to do is, I think column indicator. Yes, indicator I'm going to have as a table column. So across their headings, these are my table rows. And I'm going to take the vaccine and I'm going to click a variable. I'll show you what that does in a minute. And then we have other things here, like what do we want to display when we build the table? Do we want to display the labels for the geographic areas, or the IDs, or the IDs and the labels? Hierarchies I'll talk about a bit later. And then there's this tick box, which means exclude if fixed. And what that means is if there's only one reference area for this worksheet, it can either put it at the top as a high-level heading, or it can just remove it from the table entirely. So if there's only one reference area and I don't want to display it in the worksheet, then it essentially removes the dimension from the user's view. Okay, we can click finish at this point. I'll just take you to the next step. I'm not going to do anything on the next step because the next step's all about attributes, and I'll talk about that later. So I'm essentially going to leave this alone, and you'll notice every attribute defaults to just exclude it from the collection. That's the default, but we can do things now. So here's my demo report template created. And once I've created that, I can generate a template. And actually, there's a few things on this page. Who is the template being generated for? I'll choose Sweden. What's the frequency of the time periods in the template? I'm going to keep it on annual. And then there's the report from and report to. Report from is mandatory. Report to is optional. So I'm going to do just one time period, and I'll show you what that does on the generation of the worksheet of the workbook. Okay. So what we end up with in our reporting template is this main sheet, which gives us an overview. So who's the organization that's reporting? What's their name? Because I chose just one time period, it becomes a kind of editable field here. So the user can report their 2002 data, and they can use the same template to then report their 2003 data. Because I selected vaccine, if you recall, this was selected as a variable. What that's done is it's put the vaccine on the main page, so the user can then select select that from the main page, and that becomes relevant to everything in this subsequent second sheet. So this is it. So we have ages down here. We have indicators across the top, user fields and the values. And you'll notice that up here it's saying the reference area with the label geographic area has the value Sweden. So this has a fixed value of Sweden for ref area. I'll tell you why it did that shortly. But first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to fix a few things in this template, because these columns have defaulted to the width of the text. And in this particular example, that's not particularly good because the text is quite long. So what I can do is I can go back to the demo. And if you recall, on the second sheet here, we have this column width. And if we click here, it tells us what this means. It says 25 to 35 is a reasonable range for a width if you want to fix it. So let's pick 30. Let's pick 35, why not? Finish. And then we regenerate the template for 2002. Oh yeah, I'm actually doing this for Brazil this time, which is interesting. Which is bad. I'll open that one in a minute, but I'll do Sweden again, which you see is a lot quicker than Brazil. So now our columns are nicely restricted here to 35. So it's a better layout. Now, if I change the data provider and choose Brazil and generate a template, first of all, we see it takes longer. And then we ask why. And if I open up the template, we see it's much bigger. And we see it no longer says reporting country is Brazil up here. What it's actually got is all of the geographies here, because I said in my in my design, I said I wanted geography followed by age. So when geography has a variable value, i.e. it's not fixed to one country, it builds it into the worksheet. So the question is, why does Sweden have a fixed value and Brazil have a variable value? And for that, I'm going to go back to the presentation. And I'm going to talk about universe of data. So in the UNICEF immunization data flow, I have the dimensions I showed earlier, which are shown on the screen right now. And each dimension has a unique number of values that can be reported against the dimension. So there's 343 different reference areas that I could report. There's 16 indicators, 32 vaccines, and 16 age ranges. So what happens if I try and create a report template with these combinations, completely unrestricted? Well, let's say reference area is in the header. So I'd have 343 header cells. For each header cell, I'd have 16 indicators. And then I'd have 32 vaccines and 16 age ranges. So unrestricted, even though there's only 4 dimensions and there's not very many variables per dimension, not many unique values, we've already got a reporting universe of 2.8 million cells. Now, actually, if I were to go to the registry, I have this template here called the basic template. Vaccine in this template is no longer a variable, it's a column. So all of my dimensions are now playing a role in this. Okay, it says I'm still sharing. So I have a basic template. I click generate template for Brazil. I can't create the template because it's calculated the reporting universe as 2.8 million cells, and the limit has been set to 1 million. I can increase the limit in the registry, but 1 million is normally sufficient, given that the intention of reporting templates is for a user to fill in the template. And the reporting template just has the rows in the header, the rows of the dimensions, and vaccine is a column. So vaccine is no longer variable. That's what pushed it over the limit. How do we get around this? Well, I'm back in the presentation. I hope you can all see that.
It's good.
Yeah, okay. How do we get around this? Well, there's ways around this, but it's important to note that even with the ways that we can restrict the reporting universe, you might still consider that reporting templates are not for you, because maybe even with all the restrictions you want to add, you still have very large universes of data, in which case I would kind of revert back to these kind of flat data collections. But what you can do, and this is what I did in the FMR to allow Canada and Sweden to report data, is I simply said, when the data provider is Canada, they can only report data for the reference area Canada. And that's it. So I created a restriction against that data provider. And in SDMX, this is called a constraint, a reporting constraint. So suddenly we've reduced the reporting universe to 8,000 cells. And we can also do these types of constraints on other dimensions. And this isn't all about constraints as presentation. So there's a whole other side to SDMX. We can create sort of like rules that say things like, when this is the indicator, it can only be these vaccines. So we can create constraints that combine dimensions together. All of them play a role in defining what the final universe size is of our data that we're collecting. So if we look at the updated workflow now, so the simple workflow, we have data flows, data providers, design a template, which is what I've done. But then, and you can do this at any point, it doesn't need to be done here, it can be done after the template's designed, we can create constraints. We're restricting the reporting universe. And the model would look a little bit like this, because actually when we constrain what can be reported, we can choose at what level. For the immunization data structure, I think there's actually the data structure definition references a code list called immunization, I think it's called. No, it's called indicator. And I think there's 50 or 500 unique codes, I don't remember. There's 500 unique indicators. But for the data flow, there's a constraint which restricts it to 16. And then I have a constraint on the data provider Sweden to say when reference area is Sweden, the data provider can only provide data for the reference area of Sweden. And when we generate the reporting template, we do it in the context of a provider, and the reporting template uses data flows. So it's able to then work out exactly what the final set of series are that the user can create data for. We can think about constraints like this, which is if the data structure provides our base layer, that gives us our total universe of information. We can multiply the values of the code lists together, the unique values, and we get the universe. We can then constrain the data flow, which restricts the universe. We could constrain the provision agreement, which further restricts, and we can constrain the data provider. Now, if we constrain a data provider, we're restricting what they can provide data for across every single data flow in the system. So it's like a global rule for that provider. If we constrain this artifact called the provision agreement, what we're doing is we're constraining the provider in the context of this one flow. So they're quite powerful and they're quite good ways to set up rules. And of course, all of these rules are then used in data validation to make sure that you're collecting the data that you should be collecting and they're not reporting things they shouldn't be. Now back in the registry, I click reporting constraints. You can see I've created 4. If I wanted to create a constraint, let's constrain Brazil, because we don't have a constraint for Brazil. Owned by UNICEF. We're going to constrain the data provider. We select Brazil. And then it asks us, what do I want to restrict? I want to restrict the reference area for Brazil. I click next. What values can Brazil report for reference area? I want to look up the value, and then I'm going to select that. And that's it. In its simplest form, that's it. There's additional complexities to constraints, which I'm not going to go into. That's it. We've now restricted their universe. So in the reporting template, back to our immunization basic template, Brazil would now have a much smaller universe of data. We can see we no longer get that error, and it's generated a template where Brazil is the reporting reference area. So they're very important constraints in reporting templates. Even for a fairly low number of dimensions, they're important. That's all I'm going to go into on constraints, because it's almost its own presentation, but it's just important to get that overview. There's other ways to restrict the universe of data. I mean, I showed this already in the demo template I defined, which is you can make a dimension a variable, which immediately removes it from the table. And that's how I was able to generate data for Brazil on a completely unconstrained data structure. I hope you can see the presentation. If you can't, let me know. But yeah, okay, good. So, if I've now restrained the reference area to 1 for Brazil, if I remove the indicator dimension, that now has a value of 1 unique value. Suddenly the table that I create has now only 500 cells. So it's much more manageable for the user to report data. And of course, remember, this is 500 cells per time period. So if we generate the template for a time range of 10 years, that would be 5,000 cells within the workbook. The final way of kind of restricting the worksheet size, the table size, is you could actually split your collection up into multiple data flows. So you might have one data structure definition, and you might have a data flow for education, one for health, one for finance, and they might all use the same underlying dimensions. But you can create a data flow for each, and then you can start to restrict maybe the indicators that you're collecting for each flow. So people are then filling in a worksheet per domain of information. And of course, FMR, I'm not going to go into this, but you could use FMR then to kind of map that back into a larger cube, a larger data structure. So there's things that can be done to automate collection and then automate the mapping of that to put it into a much bigger DSD further downstream. This particular screenshot's showing a BIS collection template. This is no longer. Okay, so that's kind of really the background of reporting templates, and that's how they work. For the next 20 odd minutes, I think I'll just go through. It may not even take 20 minutes. I'll just go through now the features, so you can kind of see the different things reporting templates can do. And the first one is attribute support, because when we were looking at data structures, I was talking only about the dimensions, which are the things that must be reported. Attributes can be very useful to help us understand the data, but sometimes attributes are optional, sometimes they're kind of at the level of the entire collection. Sometimes attributes vary with observations. So in this particular screenshot, what we see is a table collecting data, the observation value here, but it's also collecting next to each value the observation confidentiality. So this is an example of an observation attribute. Each observation might have its own confidentiality status. and observation status. So this might be something like, is it missing? Is it a normal value? Is it an estimated value? So the user can start filling in 3 values per value. Now, there's a lot of options for attributes, and I'll show this in the user interface. For example, the first one in this bullet was simply exclude it from the table. So the user doesn't need to know or care about the attribute. They don't report it. The other option would be to fix the value. So you could say for this worksheet, the value of this attribute is always whatever. You can actually define a conditional rule as well. So the user doesn't report the attribute's derived from something else they have reported. So you could, for example, say if the observation value is NaN, automatically generate the obs status of M, which would be missing. This screenshot is showing the third option, which is we want the attributes reported and we want them built into the table. And then the fourth one I can show, which is we want to build a table for the values and then another table underneath just for the attributes. So you can kind of define where they're reported. And there is another kind of quite neat feature as well, which is the use of color. So you can select one attribute, one observation attribute, to be displayed as color on your table. And I'll show you how this works now, actually. I'm going to take the demo report template. I'm going to edit it to add some support for attributes. So I'm going to go straight to step 4. And I'm going to select observation confidentiality. I'm going to select use color to represent the value. I then get this table down here of these are actually all the different observation confidentialities in my code list that attribute is using. So I'm going to say, well, I don't care about all of these. I only want to collect data for confidential, free, and secondary. Secondary, not for publication. And for confidential, I want the color to be a kind of a red color, maybe that. For free, I'll have it as a kind of a green color, and I'll make it a default. And for secondary, I'll make it yellow. And I'm going to tick this thing here, and I'll tell you about that in a second. I'm going to click finish, and then I'm going to generate a worksheet for Brazil. Okay. So annoyingly, actually, that doesn't matter. Annoyingly, it's over here. We have this key up here to tell us what these colors mean. It'd be nicer if it was here, but hey. So what I can do down here, it's built me this table of observation confidentiality. And you can see as I report C for confidential, it kind of automatically colors a cell in. So I have a nice overview when I'm filling in my data. What is confidential? What is D? What's secondary? What's confidential? And what's free? The default's free, so I don't need to report it. It's just automatically free. If I hadn't ticked that box in the wizard, I wouldn't have got this table. And what that would have meant was I would have had to physically copy the color and kind of paste it in to these cells, which is a little bit more involved, actually. In fact, I think you do that. Yeah. So this kind of ticking the tick box to say, just generate me a table underneath is kind of easier for the user because they can actually control the value through the things that they report down here. So that's an example of attributes, and I have some other kind of examples of attributes that I've created here. For example, an observation attribute in the table, which are largely what have been shown already on the presentation. or we can break the attributes out into other tables. Like here, I said the observation footnote goes in its own table. So we have like a duplication of the table. What's interesting about this worksheet as well is you'll notice some of the cells are grey. That's because I actually defined a constraint which said for hepatitis B birth dose, which is row 12, they could only report data for under 1 year old, which is why it's the only one which is green. All the others are kind of grey and hashed out, which means the user can't physically report data for those cells, because in my constraint I defined that as an illegal combination of series key combinations. Another feature is to support hierarchies. So we can support hierarchies on headers or on rows. And here's an example of a hierarchy on the header. So what we see is we see like the top row is kind of grouping a number of rows underneath. And if we split the hierarchy to the row, we would see again this kind of grouping come in here. Now we can use hierarchies because we're collecting data for a particular node in the hierarchy. For example, if you look at all vaccinations, this top row, that's part of my hierarchy, and I'm collecting data for that. And you see the next row down in my hierarchy, is part of my hierarchy, but actually collect data for that code. Therefore, we're only using it as a header row, and we'll grey out the cells going along. And I'll show you how that works now. We have some time. So the way the hierarchy works is in SDMX, there's this thing called hierarchy. And this allows us to construct hierarchies, unsurprisingly. And I've defined something here which builds the vaccinations into a tree. But actually, the interesting thing about this hierarchy is it actually uses two different code lists. It uses the child health immunization vaccine code list. This is the code list used by the vaccine dimension in the data structure definition. But I actually created, this isn't a UNICEF code list, I actually created locally something called vaccines code list. And I want to use both for my hierarchy. And the reason is, in the immunization code list, it's all about immunization. So it's whether you've had the first dose, the second dose, the third dose of the immunization. But I wanted a code list which just had like the disease, if you like. So in my code list, I have things like hepatitis B and polio, and that's it. So that's my kind of like code list of various things you could get. And then underneath the, hepatitis B is something that could be caught. I then add the codes from the UNICEF code list. So when we link our reporting template to this hierarchy, it's clever enough to know that actually the data is collected against these codes, but not this code. And therefore, this is just going to be created as a grouping cell. If we go to reporting templates, we'll come to the demo template. And we'll go to step 3. And the hierarchy was on I think it's on the vaccine. So if I move the vaccine to the column, we can see on this drop down, it's picked up the fact there's an actual hierarchy which could be used for this. If I click age, it sees that there's a hierarchy for age. If I click reference area, it says, well, there's no hierarchies created for this, for any of the code lists in this dimension. Therefore, you don't get the choice. So this basically searches for hierarchies related to the code list the dimension uses, and we can choose it, and we can generate the template, and then we get the headings. And we can see when we have all vaccinations, which is part of our hierarchy, it creates a kind of double heading because it's not grouped by anything. So that's quite straightforward and quite simple. You would possibly have noticed in the demo that we have this thing called implicit. What that means is if your code list itself defines a hierarchy, because in SQMX, in the actual code list, you can say this code is a child of that code. You don't need this separate hierarchy artifact. You can say the hierarchy is whatever the code list defines as a hierarchy. A hierarchy is also a nice way of ordering the codes in the output. It can order them by exactly as you've ordered your hierarchy. Because in the hierarchy editor, you have the option of when you're building your hierarchy, you can kind of move things around, and then that's reflected in the template. And then this is really, well, the second to last thing, if you like. So this is to do with calculations built into the template. As you know, within the cell, there's a calculation. And this uses something called a validation scheme. So I could, for example, you can actually use a hierarchy for validation. So in this example, what I've done is I've created a hierarchy for age. I think I created a total age, and then all the other age ranges are a child of total. And I created a validation rule to say that the sum of all the ages must meet the hierarchy headers. So if we have a heavily hierarchical definition, each kind of heading parent node must be the sum of its child nodes. So that's quite a simple rule to set up. And then I created a more complicated rule which said, I think you couldn't have a second dose number. You couldn't have the number of people taking the second dose couldn't have been more than the number of people taking the first dose. So what I ended up with was a kind of check table. And I'll show that, and I'm going to load up the validation scheme metadata into my registry. Because it takes a while to build them. I'm not going to build it from scratch. If I look at the validation scheme, I have this two. I have one that validates age based on a hierarchy, which it shows me there. And then I have some vaccine rules. So I have, for example, the diphtheria dose 2 is less than or equal to dose 1, which says DPT2 is less than or equal to DPT1. And what that means now, if I go to a report template, the very fact those things exist, if I now generate a template here, and I have this one here, which has a hierarchy on the age, and we'll see how it looks. Okay, so let's pick some kind of indicator. I'll come back to this in a second. Here's the template. If I fill in some numbers here, 4, 5, and 6, we don't have a validation error at the moment because we haven't even filled in the total. But if I put my total as 14, we get an error of -1. There's a -1 difference between what it was expecting and what it got. So if I put 15, it says, that's fine. If I put 20, it'll be a +5 error because it's 5 more than what it was expecting. So this checking table down here is helpfully telling us where the errors lie. If I put a first dose of only 10 and a second dose of 20, I get this error here. And you can see, I don't know if you can see very easily, but this is the rule that's kind of generated. The if condition here is what's generated by when it's created. We helpfully can include this checking worksheet. It can generate this for us automatically. And it gives us an overview of the rules, the formulas, and the errors. So the user can look at this and say, I have an error count of 1 on this rule. and I actually have a difference on this particular worksheet in the hierarchy rule. So it's a pretty helpful way of reporting the errors. And in fact, if I were to actually save that worksheet, I think it's this one here. If I was to then try and load that in for validation, we can see it's got some errors in the source data set. And I click view errors, and here it says we have two errors to do with the calculations. Vaccine, the reported value of 20 is greater than 10. So that breaks that rule. And this formula for age, the reported value of 20 does not match the expected value of 15. The inputs to the calculation were 4, 5, and 6. And we can see here. So it's using that same metadata that was used to build the template in the first place to then validate the template when it's reported. So the error can be caught both client side and server side. And actually, as I'm here within the FMR, we might as well convert the data. So we can export it as CSV, for example. And we can see how that conversion would look. So this is what it would look like if the user were to have reported it using SQMX CSV format with the various things here. All of this as well, coincidentally, can be driven from web services. The generation of the report template is a web service. The validation is a web service. The conversion of the data to a different format is a web service. So this doesn't have to be a manual process. You can kind of link everything together through web services. So you can build your own UI, if you like, for generating a report template for your users to generate their own templates. There's one final bit to this presentation, which is this is the updated workflow. I've just added this thing in here to say you can create other metadata, for example, hierarchies and validation schemes. Again, you can do this at any part of the process. As I showed, I did that after the template was defined, and it just updates the generated template. So we can do these at any part of the workflow, and the template just changes based on the new metadata that exists. The final feature to show is the instruction sheet. So the idea here is you might want to provide a user with instructions on how to complete the worksheets. That's possible. You just type it in, and it supports a kind of markdown language. So we can put into our instructions things like headings and bolding. There's not too many features, but I think there's enough to provide a fairly nice instruction sheet. I'll show that in a few seconds. While I'm in this presentation, if I just conclude on this references page, you will see there is actually a wiki, other than things like the Docker to download the FMR and the products page of where you can get the software. There's a wiki, there's an FMR wiki, and there is a page for reporting templates. In the wiki, there's a lot of information. There's more information than I've presented here, so you feel free to read it. The instruction sheet here talks about the various ways that you would create headings and the syntax for creating italic and bold. It's fairly simple, it's fairly straightforward. How we do it through the UI is if we click reporting templates, back to our demo, edit the reporting template, step 2, add instruction sheet, and I can call the instruction sheet instructions, some title, we give it a width and a height, and then we can just put our heading 1, some text like this. It's quite straightforward in the heading 2. Currently, this is actually just single language instructions. I think it's the only part of the solution which is tied to one language, because everything else comes from the metadata, and all of the metadata in the registry is multilingual. So I guess this in some ways kind of lets it down a little bit. And that's it. That's, if I quickly generate template, I'll do a span over a few time periods so you can see what that looks like. There's my instructions. There's my template. There's my time period, because I think in the template design, I selected time as a row by row dimension. And that's it. That is reporting templates. That's pretty much most of the functionality. And for anything else, just take a look at the wiki.